All right, welcome back, everybody, to our discussion of philosophy of ethics. This week, we talked earlier about utilitarianism, which is a teleological theory. And today, we're going to be moving on to deontology. So, just as a reminder, going back to this same slide that we considered earlier this week, teleological approach focuses on the ends, the outcomes of our action as a way to judge the value of that act, whether or not it's moral. Deontological approaches, on the other hand, which is what we're going to be talking about today, focus on the value in the act itself. In other words, the principles that guide and tell us whether or not the act itself is just. So it focuses on the means to achieve an end, not the ends itself. So again, today we're talking about deontology, which is a principle-based approach. So in other words, principles in this case identify kinds of actions that are right or obligatory regardless of the outcomes. So you can see already how this is completely the opposite of utilitarianism, which judges everything by its outcomes. Deontological approaches say do what is right and whatever the consequences are. And there are principles that we can establish that will apply to a variety of situations. Some principles are even considered to be universal in their application that will tell us which actions are good in and of themselves and which actions are bad in and of themselves, regardless of the consequences. So they focus on principles, but this prompts the important question: how are these principles formed, right? If we have the principles, that's probably easy enough to follow, but how do we come up with these principles that guide our action in the first place? Okay, well, so for our starting point, we're going to start with a philosopher named Immanuel Kant. Now, he followed the Enlightenment period, a time when the idea of humanity having intrinsic worth and value was very popular. And so in contrast to utilitarianism, suggested that duty is superior to happiness. So it's not about what makes us happy, it's about following what our duty is, what we're obliged to do. So the moral value of an action follows from duty or obligation, not from a natural inclination or desire. In fact, he even said that we should suppress those initial inclinations or desires and instead focus on doing only those things that we are duty bound to do. So you can see here that he even said that it's better that the whole people should perish than that injustice should be done, right? This is the complete opposite, you can see, of utilitarianism. So where utilitarianism might say it's better that one person die than the whole people perish, Kant is saying better that the whole people perish than an injustice be done if it's unjust for that one person to die. So again, he's holding very strongly to the principle determines whether the action is right or wrong, regardless of the consequences that come about. And so this focus on duty allowed him to create what was called the categorical imperative. This is how Kant determines the principles of what is right and wrong. The categorical imperative is broken into two parts, or we're going to call them formulations. So the first formulation of the categorical imperative is this: act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. That's a really complicated way of saying don't make an exception of yourself and your actions. Only act in such a way that you could also reason that everybody universally should act the exact same way. So if in a moment you could not make that rationalization, if the way that you are acting, if you could not also justify that everybody in all instances should always act that way, then you're making an exception of yourself and you're acting immorally. So this has been coined as universalizability. That's a a complicated title for this, but if, essentially it's just saying, how universalizable is this? Can you universalize your theory? Or are you saying it only applies to you and only applies under certain circumstances? So one example would be, you should never lie. Now, consider that. If I were to say it is okay for me to lie, universally, I'd be saying it's okay for anyone under any circumstances to lie. And you can see how that would hinder our ability to have any kind of social relationship with anyone at all. So again, the principle determines the rightness or wrongness of it based on how universal you can make that approach. So the second formulation of the categorical imperative is this: people, including ourselves, are never to be treated in an instrumental way as a means merely, but only as ends in themselves. This goes back to the idea of humanity having intrinsic value and intrinsic worth, to be treated as an ends and not a means. So a good example of this would be if you eat at a restaurant, paying the restaurant and tipping the waiters is treating them as ends. Dining and dashing treats them as a means. So you're using them instrumentally to achieve some good for yourself, but you're not treating them as an ends in and of themselves. So again, these two principles form kind of the categorical imperative. This drives for Kant how we determine moral action. These are the principles by which we can determine if something is right or wrong. Number one, can I universalize what I'm about to do? Can I make it a universal law for everyone? And number two, am I treating someone as an end in and of themselves, or am I using them as a means to achieve some other end? And again, that includes yourself. Am I treating myself as a means to an end? Okay, so the second philosopher we're going to talk about is much later. His name is John Rawls. Some quick notes on him. He had a Bronze Star in World War II, National Humanities Medal awarded to him from President Bill Clinton. And really, he continues, his work continues to dominate modern political philosophy. Even though he's received quite a bit of criticism for some of his work, he continues to kind of dominate the scene. So for John Rawls, you'll see that it's very similar in its deontological approach, but the way that he comes up with the principles that should determine action is a little different. So for Rawls, he starts from what he calls the original position. So he describes it this way: among the essential features of this situation, the original position, is that no one knows his place in society, his class position or social status, nor does anyone know his fortune and the distribution of natural assets and abilities, his intelligence, strength, and the like. I shall even assume that the parties do not know their conceptions of the good or their special psychological propensities. The principles of justice are chosen behind a veil of ignorance. So this has become coined as a thought experiment called the veil of ignorance. So he's essentially saying, let's think about if you were behind this veil of ignorance. You had no idea. You knew that you were going to, be part of a society, but you had no idea what your class position would be, how much money you'd have, what your intelligence is, what your sex would be, any of these kinds of things. You know nothing of that. What principles would you subscribe to or agree to for that society? If you knew none of that, what would you agree to live by in that society? Well, Rawls suggests two principles that everyone would universally agree on. The first one is this: each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive total system of basic liberty compatible with a similar system of liberty for all. So in other words, it's saying, does the action protect my right from invasion? And does it ensure that I have equal rights with all the other persons? That's a reasonable thing maybe to assume, right? If I'm behind a veil of ignorance and I don't know what my social situation is going to be coming into this society, I would want to make sure that I have an equal right in the system and that I have equal liberties and rights as anybody else, right? So he you can see that he's similar to Kant in that we don't want to treat persons as a mere means. We want equality, right? That everybody is treated as an end. The second principle that he says we would all agree to behind this veil of ignorance is that social and economic equalities are to be arranged so that they're to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged. So breaking this up just a little bit. First of all, it's acknowledging that from behind this veil of ignorance, we would acknowledge, you know what, there's probably going to be inequalities in this society that we're going to have. However, we would also say, well, that's okay, but I'm okay to come into this society knowing that that if I'm the greatest at the greatest disadvantage, that the resources and economic equalities will be distributed to be most advantageous for me. So in other words, he's saying we're morally obligated to help those who are worse off, unless it makes everyone else worse off. Again, this is a principle from behind a veil of ignorance that we would all agree to, right? We may not agree to that now, knowing where our social status is, how much money I have, where I sit. I may say, no, I don't agree to that principle. But behind the veil of ignorance and not knowing any of these things, he's saying that anyone would agree to say, look, if I end up being the worst off, I want to know that that those benefits are going to be arranged to make me better off. And so this theory is really about making an efficient and most importantly, a just use of resources and the distribution of those resources. Okay, so you can kind of see there's two different deontological approaches. You have Kant with his categorical imperative, and you have Rawls with the veil of ignorance. This is their way of deriving principles by which we can judge whether an act is good in and of itself, regardless of whatever consequences come as a result of that act. So it's important to think at this point about what are some of the principles in public administration? What are those guiding principles? Can we come up with a deontological principle or two for public administration? How do we govern in government? Is there a way to know that something's right regardless of whether or not the consequences are necessarily good? Some things to think about. First and foremost, a lot of scholars, public administration scholars, have pointed to the fact that that modern public administration deals with Western principles of truth-telling, promise keeping, the sanctity of life, justice, democracy, freedom, property, right? These liberal ideologies are pervasive in what guides our public administrative action. And then in the American context specifically, and it's constitutionalism, there are a number of principles embodied in the Constitution that govern the rightness or wrongness of our behavior, regardless of outcomes, right? So we have the free exercise of religion, freedom of speech and press, the right to peaceably assemble. Every person should be accorded equal protection under the laws, not being deprived of liberty or property without due process. Private property can only be taken for public use and with just compensation. Persons should not be subject to reasonable searches and seizures. No person shall be subject to cruel or unusual punishment. So you can see how we can use constitutional principles that can guide our actions. And we can say, well, you know, these principles we're going to hold as guiding principles for what's right and wrong, regardless of what actions or what consequences come as a result of the actions. These are principles we can always live by. So part of the problem with any ethical theory is what happens when you have conflicting principles. So it's all fine and dandy to say, well, here we can list out all of these principles that guide whether or not an action is ethical. But what happens when maybe two of those principles conflict with each other? Well, ethical theory has determined, especially deontological theory, has parsed between prima facie duties and actual duties. In other words, what is kind of a first order duty versus like a higher order duty? So a good example, you may have like a prima facie duty to keep a promise to meet up with a friend for lunch. Is it good? Is it moral to keep promises? Absolutely, right? We can have that principle to never lie and to keep promises, right? But all of a sudden we come across a greater obligation to help a person in dire need. So we may come across someone that's stranded or their life is in danger. We may have the moral obligation to meet that higher duty to save someone in need, even at the cost of having to break the principle and break our promise essentially, and not fulfill that duty that we have to a friend. And so you have this comparison of these duties and how we can weigh those duties and which one is more imperative for us to fulfill. And so it raises the question, doesn't this break the universality principle? You say, wait a second, I thought Kant said the whole point of the categorical imperative was to say, only do things that you can make universal for everybody in all situations, right? Doesn't this break that? Well, if you think about it this way, if the exception is built into the principle, then it's not actually an exception, but part of the principle. So if I go into this saying my principle is that, promise keeping is a prima facie duty, but the sanctity of life and preserving life is a higher duty, then we're not in conflict with our principle. We are fulfilling a higher obligation that we recognize within our principles. So again, it doesn't necessarily mean that just to have a principle for action doesn't necessarily mean that it will always be at the forefront of determining what our action is, but it could mean that we have several principles that come to bear on a given action, and we have to decide which of those obligations that we have holds the highest weight. And that, so Kant and deontological scholars would say that the highest duty is what you have the moral obligation to fulfill in that moment. So let's consider for a second another Marvel example. We're going to stay in the Marvel universe to talk about these principles. If you've seen Civil War, Captain America Civil War, the Avengers split into two sides and they have an argument. The government essentially comes in and says, you guys have been reckless. You've caused destruction and death all over the world. Even though you've been trying to save everybody, you've done it carelessly and casually, and you've cost too many lives. And so we are going to rein you in. And the United Nations gives them the accords, right, to that puts the UN as sovereign over the Avengers to give them some bounds, and says essentially you can't save anyone unless we call on you to do it. So they break into two camps. Iron Man and the group on the left subscribe to the idea that it's better that they submit themselves to some restrictions and some constraints so that everyone else is better off. Can you think about which approach that would be? This is utilitarianism, right? We're considering the ends. We've killed way too many innocents. We've been unreined and unchecked. And it's better that we tie our hands a little bit and be subject to the United Nations so that the consequences of our actions are better. We achieve better results. Captain America and his crew take a different approach in saying, no, our liberty, our ability to choose is the highest importance. And there's, no matter what the cost of saving lives is, our job to protect the people is most important, even if it comes at the lives of innocents. That's our job, and that's the duty that we have to fulfill. So you can see how this is the deontological approach, right? They're saying it doesn't matter what the consequences are. We have a duty. We have been given gifts, and we have a moral obligation to fulfill those gifts. And if we are restricting ourselves, if we're allowing that to be taken away from us, we're not acting true to our principles. And so they're less concerned about the outcomes in this situation. So again, a classic battle between utilitarianism and deontological principle-based approach for this example. Okay, so finally, just to summarize between kind of last video and this video, so we have kind of three different values that we focused on here. So last week we talked about utility. So Bentham and Mills, they focused on utility being the main indicator for whether something is right or wrong. Does it bring about the greatest good for the greatest number? Does it make us happy? Does it bring us pleasure? What's its utility? Does it make us better off? Kant comes in and focuses on rights and their associated duties. So anytime I have a right to something, someone else has a duty or an obligation to fulfill that right. So they're inseparable, duty and rights are inseparably connected. And so he points out that our duties to fulfill other people's rights, they're to treat them as ends and not as means, is of highest importance. And then on the last side, you have justice, which is what Rawls talks about, that from behind a veil of ignorance, we would all agree to the principle that the distribution of resources and goods should be just and equitable and fair. And so those principles are what should guide our everyday interaction. Okay, so this wraps up our introduction here to deontological approaches. Next week, we're going to move into virtue ethics and social contract theory, so we can be looking forward to that. Again, these are just laying the foundations for moral reasoning, and as we move into kind of more contemporary administrative ethical theories, we'll see how these basic frameworks for moral reasoning come to bear. Thank you. Have a great weekend.